podcasserole. Welcome in.
You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast, a proud member of the Podcasserole Network. Hello, Jamie.
Well, hello there, Peter.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Earlier this week, earlier this week, I spoke to a really interesting leader in Hawaii, not for the podcast. He was referred to me to kind of think through leadership particularly for where I'm headed in terms of heading to Colombia. And he encouraged me to do one of those strength tests.
Strength Finder?
Yeah, Strength Finder. And I've always been sort of like scared of doing them. And in fact, the person who encouraged me to talk to him was like, oh, get ready. He's going to look into your soul. So we haven't had our follow-up meeting. We'll have that later next month. And
what did he find when he looked into your soul? Darkness.
Well, you do the assessment yourself, and then he's going to help interpret it for me.
Yeah.
One of the things I thought was kind of interesting, though, was this strength for me is it's called context one of the 5 words. Context is one of my strengths. And that is that I regularly look back to better understand where I'm going. And so I'm not a futurist as some are. They're constantly looking to the future. I'm constantly trying to learn from what has happened. And I think that makes sense. I mean, our podcast is about reflecting on
after-action
past,
review.
right? So I'm glad I'm consistent.
We'll talk about the first book you name in the interview in this particular.
Well, that's what I'm going to say. Okay, so looking back to know where you're going, our guest today, Larry Cuban, certainly is an individual who has been at this for a long time.
Yeah.
And certainly can help us think about where we've been to where we're going. Before we even jump into the conversation, I want to note, while I can't see it right now on the screen, you are wearing your Stanford, there it is. Look at that. Stanford sweatshirt.
Go Cardinals.
Who would have thought that you would have coordinated, like, I got to talk about Larry Cuban today. He's a professor at Stanford, he's a former superintendent in the East Coast, but I'm going to wear my Stanford sweatshirt and show some pride.
As you know, I went to Stanford, and I went to Stanford ed school. Undergraduate I did at California State University, Chico, or Chico State, go Wildcats. And Dr. Cuban and Dr. Tyack were my professors while I was at Stanford. Yeah, and so I remember their course, and I remember reading the book, Tinkering Towards Utopia. And I probably have that. I have the book somewhere in this house. It's probably somewhere. Maybe it might be in a box in the shed, but I don't know. So I was really excited. I was kind of excited to oh, wow. I was too young to actually engage with Dr. Cuban at that time. Plus, my entire focus was on get me into the classroom as fast as possible. Like this whole, let's be academics. I'm like, I don't care about this. I care about being on the ground. And now, now at my age, I'm ready. I'm ready to let's go to course. Let's go class.
Yeah.
Let's go to class.
I'm so glad that you've come kind of full circle now. It's sort of to re-engage with somebody who had no doubt a presence in your early years as an educator, and to circle back and now engage in a different way. I love it.
Totally. Let's get into it, man. I mean, I don't know if I want to say much more. If I were to say something to look towards in the conversation, I probably would lean. There isn't one theme save for. And this is going to be obvious. It's not like you have to listen hard for this, but, he really talks about the concept of conflict, navigating conflict as a superintendent, which is where the conversation led, sort of led down this path around being a superintendent when he was in Arlington. And I want to bring that up. I want to talk about this concept of navigating conflict, and the context in which he brings it up is in relation to his after action review. And I think, it's true, but I also have I don't know. I don't want to say it's different. It's more like a more nuanced view on the way in which he was talking about it.
So why don't we get into it? I would say
I'm not even sure it's more nuanced. It's just different. I'll just say different.
Okay. Well, I would say that there is one theme in his conversation that I sort of listened for as I was re-listening in advance of our conversation today. And that's this idea that he reminds us of the real excellence that grows from the wisdom of teachers. And so that does bring me to our sponsor today, IXL, because today's teachers are caring more than ever. And so that's really where IXL can come in. It lightens the load by personalizing learning for every student, automatically adapting so teachers can focus on what matters most, teaching. So if you're walking the leadership tightrope, looking for a research-proven way to boost learning for everyone, IXL can help. Learn more at ixl.com/imperfect. All right, Jamie, let's get into it, all right?
Let's do it.
You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
And I'm Jamie Almanzan.
We'll see you on the other side. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dr. Larry Cuban is my guest. Larry has been a high school teacher in Cleveland, Ohio, and Washington, D.C. He's served as a school system superintendent in Arlington, Virginia. He has taught future educators and is now a professor emeritus at Stanford University. He is the author of numerous books, including Tinkering Towards Utopia with David Tayek, and is the former president of the American Educational Research Association, AERA. All of that is very nice, but I know that he takes great pleasure in knowing that he was named Teacher of the Year by students in Stanford's School of Education 7 times. Larry Cuban, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation and look forward to our conversation.
I'm just thrilled. And Dr. Cuban, it is really such an honor to have you on the podcast. Your scholarship, including books like From Tinkering Towards Utopia to The Enduring Classroom, they've really had a profound influence on how leaders think about reform, particularly your framing of schools as institutions that, despite waves of reform, remain remarkably stable. I have a phrase that I sometimes use that is, when leaders agitate for change, the system will work aggressively to return to status quo. I don't know if that resonates for you.
It does, yes.
Are you familiar with Scott Nearing's book, A New Education?
I looked it up, and Scott Nearing was a devotee of John Dewey.
That's right.
And so what we're talking about is the progressive effort to alter traditional schools in the early 20th century.
That's right. Yeah, in 1910, he was commissioned to travel the country for 2 years and look for evidence of schools doing things differently, a departure from what would be considered the factory model and looking for ways that. And so as I was reading your work and thinking about his work, I thought that there were so many similarities. And in particular, Scott Nearing asks the question, he says, are schools designed for children, or are children being designed to fit the schools? And I thought similarly, you've asked that question about teachers. Are we forcing teachers to fit into a certain mold, or are we willing to allow teachers to help us lead this new way of thinking for schools and for children? Both of you point toward a vision of education that's practical and relevant and really centered on children and community. And so I think with that in mind, my first question for you is, if you wouldn't mind maybe talking about the new needs of the new life, or your own advocacy for adaptive tinkering and inside-out reform.
Yeah, schools, the phrase remarkably stable, I think is a fair phrase. The schools were set up primarily for many reasons: to develop critical thinkers, good citizens, and socialize children. But the primary function of tax-supported public schools is to socialize children into the community's values. That's the primary. There are other goals for schools and so on, but schools are socializing instruments of the society. And there's no other way around that. You can see that best by going into a kindergarten. And kindergarten teachers are clearly socializing kids to take turns, stand in line, to wait. And waiting is part of schooling. One of the best books I ever read about schooling was Phil Jackson's book. Philip Jackson wrote a wonderful book, and the first chapter is called The Daily Grind. And it gets at what school is really, and the primary focus is to socialize children to be part of a crowd that follows the rules.
Yeah. I find that curious, particularly when you think about how interconnected our world is now. So you think about if its genesis was about mirroring the local values, why we're fervently, dedicated and committed to local control, I guess, because we want sort of the local values to permeate through our schools. And meanwhile, we're so now interconnected, and it seems that's been disrupted to some extent. And I'm curious what your thoughts are around, if it's about socializing, particularly right now, we're struggling with that in terms of our ability. You talk about teaching values of like sharing and taking turns and listening and empathizing and caring. And we sort of have tossed that out to some extent.
Yeah, what has really changed has been beginning about 10, 15 years ago is the internet and the access to devices that kids have as early as age 10 or before, but mostly a lot of kids get their first iPhones and other kinds of devices, Chat GPT, all of those kinds of things that answer questions, that explore like at an early age. And that has been a big deal from my point of view in socializing kids beyond school.
Totally agree. And actually, I'd like to extend this to my next question, which really speaks to the fact that you often, at least in what I've been reading and listened to what you have said, you want us really to be leveraging the expertise of the teachers who really are the ones interacting most directly with children. And so if superintendents are the ones making these decisions about and without engaging the people most impacted, then we've sort of fallen short. Our guest today is Dr. Larry Cuban, teacher, leader, professor, author. And Larry, in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension, the leader's learning work. And inside that dimension, there's a term, harvesting the collective wisdom. And so you've written that excellence can't be coerced and that real improvement comes from the teacher's wisdom of practice, essentially harvesting their wisdom for direct improvement. Superintendents have to they're handed these long lists of mandates, things to implement, whether from their community or from their board or from their state and national legislators. And so as someone who has lived the complexity of this work as a superintendent and then as a professor in influencing our field so directly, I wonder, what does it look like for a leader to honor both meeting the accountability demands while also trusting the teachers to adapt reforms in a way that's actually helpful?
Yeah, it's walking a tightrope.
To be sure.
Yeah, it's walking a tightrope, holding. You remember those images of someone walking between two skyscrapers and holding a pole?
Sure.
It's that kind of it's that kind of balancing act that superintendents have to do. They have to protect teachers, buffer teachers from outside sources, but at the same time, they have to energize teachers to do what is necessary to develop. It's to protect and create room for teachers, protect teachers and create room for teachers to do what they do best once they close the classroom door.
These teachers are all digital natives themselves now. These younger teachers who grew up, we talk about 10, 15 years ago, is that it was around 2007, the iPhone, 2008, the Android, 2010, the social media companies really took off in terms of, and that's when you look at teachers today, they may have been 10, 12, 15 years old when all of this happened. This is their world. And so it's just, to me, so many of their superintendents, that's not their world. Any thoughts?
The superintendent, you talk about imperfect leaders. The superintendent, at best, is an imperfect leader because he or she has to walk this tightrope between doing what the board of trustees want, because they hired the superintendent and they can fire the superintendent. And at the same time, if in my case, I had a teacher's background, and when I was superintendent in Arlington for the 7 years, I always saw my job as helping teachers, protecting them, but also if teachers screwed up, they had to be accountable for that too. Because as being a superintendent, there are always a few teachers that mess up.
That's right. That's true. I recently had a conversation with Carl Cohn, and he really wanted to stress the fact that there was a time where our primary job was to be that lead learner, that head teacher, certainly the leader of the district, but also that lead instructional leader. And he's arguing that so much has changed that we really have to be mindful of our civic leader role and trying to navigate, and to your point, walking that tightrope of trying to navigate a board, the politics, and our primary function to help children, I guess, to some extent, socialize them as well as part of that socialization, help them learn to read, to write.
Yeah, you started the Deweyan version of schooling with Scott Nearing and all that. What they ignore is the inherent conflict that is part of being a superintendent, because the superintendent has to negotiate with many participants and stakeholders continually. You have the community, you have a teachers union, as we did in Arlington. You have the teachers, not only the unionized teachers, but the teachers individually who would come and ask you for things. You would make an appointment and do that. You have the principals who were organized into a union. And then you have the central office staff, which in cabinet meetings every week, and they have their demands and what you ought to do. What I learned as a superintendent is I had never thought of or experienced all this conflict. And the game of being a superintendent is a game of negotiating conflict all the time. Every day. I cannot think of a day that was conflict-free.
That is so true. As you were describing, I'm thinking, and then there's the bus drivers and the custodians and nutrition services, and then all your external contractors, if you're building something, and all of those pieces, your Chamber of Commerce, your internal and external systems, it is all day dealing with conflict.
That is
Makes
true.
me feel a little bit better about how I may have behaved when I got home. I was like, no more conflict. Just let me, you come home, your children are arguing. You're like, no, not here. Oh my gosh. I'd like to ask you a question that I ask every guest on our program, and you touched on it a little bit. I want to explore it a little bit more. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Since I'm of an age in which I've seen an awful lot, I've given up. I had given up on seeking perfection decades ago. What I have settled for, what it's worth, is good enough. And so a good enough leader is what I think of when you say imperfect leader. And good enough means that it fits the situation. That leader is a good fit with the environment in which he or she lives. If it's a small superintendency of less than 5,000, if it's a moderate-sized district, or even a big city, good enough works. And that has been far better than perfection when I come to it. It seems very realistic, and it allows for me to pursue the goals that I think are necessary for where I'm working.
So I want to talk a minute about the Mosaic Project. It is one of our favorite organizations and has over 25 years of experience empowering students to really celebrate differences, communicate assertively, and resolve conflict peacefully at their outdoor school. I happen to have experience being part of the Mosaic Project, and so I can absolutely tell you it's an amazing organization. Their innovative SEL curriculum is now available to our Imperfect Leader audience. And so you can get a 10% discount through their new documentary film-based Mosaic Classroom Project. So just let the people know during your onboarding process to receive that 10% discount is to just mention An Imperfect Leader. Learn more about the Mosaic Project at mosaicproject.org.
This is Greg Meyer, Jamie's partner at APC Leadership Collaborative. Superintendents know that school principals are the single biggest lever that any school district has for improving student joy and success. Unfortunately, there's very little professional development for the specific things that a principal has to do to improve their school. At APC Leadership Collaborative, we specialize in coaching principals to take on audacious goals, build their leadership skills, and make big improvements in their school. If that inspires you, let's connect and talk about how we can collaborate. Find APC Leadership Collaborative online at apccolab.com.
When leaders think in systems, they think differently. They see the big picture, making decisions that create coherence and strengthen communication across their teams. They build adaptability, flexibility, and engagement. Every day, school leaders face complex challenges, from student engagement to staff alignment. What if your team could see those challenges as part of a bigger picture? That's what happens when you think in systems. It's how leaders turn complexity into connection and challenges into opportunities for growth. At the Waters Center for Systems Thinking, we help educators and organizations build this capacity, developing the habits and tools that turn vision into action. Think differently, think in systems. Sign up for our webinars, free resources, or a consultation by visiting our website, which you can find in the show notes.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action, and our guest today is Dr. Larry Cuban. teacher, leader, professor, author. And in this segment, just like we do each week, we ask about a decision that was made and then what'd you learn from it? Larry, what happened?
Okay, in the district where I was superintendent for 7 years, the big deal was that the student enrollment was shrinking, and we were getting not only smaller, but more culturally diverse. We had a large influx of Latino boys and girls. There was a small segment of Black students. And so becoming ethnically and culturally diverse at the same time that you're becoming smaller led to the issue of closing schools. And if you ever had any experience with closing schools, it's conflict written in capital letters.
No doubt. It is a third rail issue. This is a great topic. Even in the last year, if you're looking at San Francisco, Oakland, Seattle, and then smaller districts all across the nation, particularly as they are competing with potentially charter schools and vouchers. And so they're just seeing shrinking in terms of some of their enrollment and having to make some tough decisions. Wow. Okay. Go. Tell me.
Arlington went from 22,000 students to 15,000 when I arrived. So there were schools that had less than 100 to 200 kids. And as there are capital costs that you have to absorb for every school, and these were, in effect, these small schools became high-priced items, and we were dependent upon the county board of supervisors for our budget. So they wanted us to cut back, reduce expenditures, and closing schools was one way to do that. The conflict was enormous. Which schools to close? I and my staff drew up guidelines and principles that the board could follow, and then I would make recommendations to the school board of which schools to close.
And this would be to sort of mitigate the lobbying that was anticipated. So if you had clear principles and guidelines, you knew that, or at least you could try to avoid accusations of you're closing this school because it's in a poorer neighborhood. You're closing this school because of whatever. You had
Precisely.
Okay.
Precisely. And it was extremely difficult. The lobbying was endless. And the board members would come to me, some of them crying about what to do because one of the schools that we recommended to the board was in their particular bailiwick, because board members represented different parts of the school.
Oh, gotcha. The added politics of I won't get reelected if they close the school. I presided over a decision to close the school in my district, in my ward.
I know. It was a very difficult time. And going home for dinner before a board meeting at night was a brief respite from that. And it took
and a side of antacid.
It took a personal toll on me and my wife, my 2 daughters. It did, because my daughters were in the public schools too.
Yes.
My daughters would even hear the guff from teachers we had to let go a lot of teachers to reduce costs. Yeah, it was a very difficult time closing schools, and that lasted throughout my tenure as over the 7 years. Yeah.
I think...
But the board did renew my contract.
I have no doubt. It is such a difficult time when you think about, closing schools. You and I share a friend in Gary Yee who had to preside over such a difficult decision. Those of us who had to lead during the pandemic have a similar sort of story to tell in terms of our families having to also carry the trauma of these decisions and everybody thinking it was totally appropriate to corner them and say, what on earth is your husband doing? So, yeah. So as you look back on the decision, we always ask what got overlooked. And as you indicated so brilliantly, there's no perfect way of dealing with complex situations. Good enough means trying to do the very best you can with the hand you've been dealt. And as you look back, though, and as you probably have used this story as a case study with other leaders, what would you say got overlooked?
I would say that one thing that occurred to me was that superintendents are not often prepared to deal with conflict. Now, I don't know what you can do in training superintendents to prepare them for conflict, but in most situations, people who ascend to the superintendency after being a teacher, a principal, maybe a central office administrator, and then becoming superintendent, they are really unprepared to deal with this conflict, which is really basically can be highly personal and at the same time is so necessary to cope with and not alienate people with. Superintendents have to deal with conflicts in their school boards. I had a 5-member board, and things would often get contentious. How to deal with that conflict when you are the person that the board hired to run the district? You can't tell the board what to do other than make recommendations. They're the policy deciders, not the superintendent.
Right.
That's a lesson that a lot of superintendents don't learn until they're superintendent.
So specifically in the situation you were in, you were very thoughtful about coming up with guidelines and principles for how decisions would be made when closing a school or making the recommendation. Are you suggesting or sort of reflecting back now, and I'm wondering if something that got overlooked was a similar sort of protocol or guidelines for when there's going to be conflict, that superintendents, you're shaking your head no, so that's why I stopped talking.
I thought that conflict was part of the game. And because conflict can be so personal and everything, I learned that you don't make it personal. But I had to learn through making mistakes.
Gotcha.
Oh, you make enemies when you're the superintendent. It's inevitable. From day one, you're making decisions. And some decisions are applauded and some are thumbs down on those decisions. It's inevitable that you build up people who don't like you for being as a superintendent, don't agree with your decisions, and you build up supporters. And that's what happens over the point of the tenure of a superintendent.
Yeah.
So
you and I both did it for 7 years, and I could see the mobilization of supporters and those who opposed the vision that my administration was responsible for, casting a vision, and then the board decides whether or not, as locally elected officials, if they believe in it as well, for which I was grateful that they did, because it was about creating opportunities for kids, particularly those who had been underserved by a system that privileged others. And, you know, what my own sort of looking back is what got overlooked was I didn't communicate well enough that a scarcity mindset ought to be recognized. Oh, I see you think you're losing something when we're providing resource to those who have not traditionally had resource. And I wonder, similarly with closing a school, there's an attitude of what we're going to lose. We lose our community. We lose the ability to walk to school, as opposed to maybe thinking, as they did in Hartford, Connecticut, when they closed the school, they communicated, this is what our kids now get. We have more opportunity to provide programming that didn't exist because we couldn't provide it over all these schools. We can now centralize that. We can highlight the certain talented teachers that were just one or two. They now work together in that same school to make better opportunities for kids. Instead, so that was, for me, was my communication of what we get, not what we lose.
And I would agree with that completely, but I had to learn that the hard way. Yeah, that you end up saying, what are the gains from the loss? What you experience as a loss, what are the possible gains? Which then goes to looking at the school that your kids are going to be going to. Yeah, that I learned that. It didn't happen when we closed our first few schools, but because we had to close so many of our schools,
right?
We closed over a dozen schools in a district of 15,000. That's a lot. But we learned through that process exactly what you just said, Peter. Yeah.
So initially it was purely, we think we're tasked with being good stewards of the community's money. And financially, this doesn't make sense. We've got fixed costs that are increasing. We've got the operating costs that are increasing. It's just so expensive to operate a school that has only 100 students in it. And that probably remained as a talking point. And you added, and this is what our kids get. They get a better educational experience within our district.
Yeah, you would have, in this case, when we closed an elementary school and shifted kids to another elementary school, or we changed to middle schools.
Oh,
Yeah, and the change to middle schools then made a broader curriculum, more opportunities for kids. But again, if I had to learn that,
right.
and I would have the metaphorical scars to show that.
When you said you moved to a middle school from a junior high model and created teams and opportunities for kids to continue to connect in a community, as well as opportunities for them to explore different co-curricular, extracurricular type things, is that?
Yeah, what we did was to reorganize secondary education.
Yeah.
We went from junior highs to middle schools and then to 4-year high schools.
Okay, so we did something similar in Columbia, Missouri, and I would say one unintended consequence was your 9th grade teachers who went down to 8th grade had such a shock. We didn't do a very good job of preparing them for middle school. Because we had 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 10, 11, 12. And so then we made middle schools and closed the junior highs and turned them into middle schools and then the high schools. Oh my, what a shock.
I consider it one of the small victories because the board and the superintendent were together on it. There wasn't any space between me and the board on it. We all thought that this had to be done, the reorganization of grades.
Right.
And it was a shock to many in the community. So you can imagine what some of those board meetings and what they called public sessions were like.
Oh my. Yes, I'm sure. And everybody took the full 3 minutes and then said, and hold on. And the next person would come up and just pick up where that person left off for the next 3 minutes.
Right.
Yeah. During the pandemic, they could also Zoom in and make public comment. And so people would say, hold on, I'm going to hand this over to my roommate. And then the next person would start talking. Those meetings, they never ended. Can I ask what you learned? And I'm going to go back to the closing of the school as the topic that we've been talking about. What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
I ended up, part of my repertoire was that I said on day one, after the board had appointed me, that I would be visiting schools every week. And my 2 predecessors had hardly ever been in school unless there was a crisis. So I set up, my secretary was excellent, and she set up visits to schools. And these were, the principal knew when I was coming, and rather than a sudden cold call visit, that kind of. So the visiting of schools, I started the first week that I was superintendent when the school opened. And I did that for the 7 years that I was superintendent. And the fact that I was in schools and that we had over about 1,000 to 1,200 teachers. I knew a lot of the teachers by name, and I had been in their classrooms.
Amazing.
It was an enormous help for me, particularly when the union went after me. And I forget the word, but they condemned me, the union, because I didn't go along with the salary requests that they had made of the school.
Like a no confidence. They wanted a no confidence.
It was a no confidence vote. Thank you.
Yeah.
I forgot.
I'm sorry for reminding you, but I think that was the word.
Yeah, so the union had no confidence. Of course, when the union says they have no confidence, a lot of the teachers who, even though they were union members, they knew me. I had been in
He'd been in my classroom. He left me a note, right? He saw me teach.
You know that. Yeah. Every time I visited a classroom, I wrote the teacher a personal.
Great advice. And you'll find that teachers put them up on their bulletin boards.
It says Office of the Superintendent.
Of course.
And then I would sign it Larry. Never Larry.
I love it.
Yeah. And Arlington was the kind of community where everyone addressed you as Dr. Cuban.
Yeah.
I would say, and I understood that. It was important to them. And we're talking about the learning about social distance and all of that. I understood that. But after a while, people would call me Larry, and that I found to be very important.
That's actually a true testament to leading as a lead learner as opposed to leading by title.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. In the end, what was something that was good that came out of your situation?
What was good was, number one, I survived. I finished my 4-year. They renewed my contract. A new board had come in. a new school board, an elected board that was heavily leaned toward political conservatism. And it was clear that they wanted someone else. So I told my wife and the kids that this was the year before I left the superintendency, that I said, I'm not going to ask for renewal. I won't get it anyway. And I'm tired. 7 years was a good run for me. So I said, I will look for another job afterwards. And so my family knew that. And that's the way it worked out. So my last year, I was a lame duck. Everyone knew that the board was conservative. They wanted another kind of superintendent who wouldn't spend as much money as I and the board had done. They wanted to cut costs. And I said, well, that's what happens. That's the nature of the game that I'm in. And I accepted that. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I describe it as almost the baseball manager.
Yeah.
It's just part of the game sometimes where the manager is replaced by someone else, and that they will find the right spot for them that moves them forward. And that you can pull that metaphor even forward. Those players sometimes are amazing. Like you got a Reggie Jackson who will hit a home run. He'll be Mr. October, but mouths the entire time on the bench. And so you're like, I got that principal who is always home run hitter, but boy, can be a real challenge. When you think back on what was something that was good, so you survived, you left on your own terms.
Yeah.
From the decision to close the schools, I imagine looking back that you put them in a much better position, that your successor really didn't have to. That's a really hard job to do, to close schools. People can do the superintendency and just sort of coast.
Yes.
You took on some really important work to make for better opportunities for kids. I imagine that's something as you look back was something that was good that came out of that situation for Arlington.
I felt it wasn't something I chose.
Of course. No, you didn't walk in going, I think we should close some schools.
Yeah. This was the context, and you adapt to the context. You do the best you can. And after I had finished, I had a feeling of that I did the best that I could do. And I thought the school district was stronger after I left. That's patting myself on the back, but so be it. But I felt good about it.
Yeah, I'm not asking you to boast. I'm asking you the true question. What was something that was good that came out of it? So I think you ought to celebrate the fact that because of your actions, working closely with the board, considering the internal and external systems, that you were successful. This was a success, as difficult as it was.
Yeah, I'd like to look at it that way. Others may see it different, particularly if they were in the schools that were closed and so on like that, because there was a great deal of conflict. But nonetheless, I finished the 7 years, and I thought it was a good run, but I was exhausted. There was no question about it. It was the only job I had ever had in my life that I expended so much energy, brain power, and everything, and also learned so much.
I can totally relate to that. I do remember when I did retire from the superintendency and then I was home a lot more, that my family asked questions like, is there any meeting you could possibly go to? Because I was always at a meeting. I was always at a ball game, always at a performance, always at a city council or some type of meeting. And all of a sudden you're home. Let me ask you my last question would be, what advice would you give to an aspiring leader, someone who's entering the field of leadership?
I would say that I would ask questions. Have you ever been in a conflict with a personal conflict, and what happened? And have you ever been in conflict with people that you don't know and what had happened there? Again, I'm focusing on the nature of conflict because that's what I experienced. And I think every superintendent at some level has to deal with conflict. It's inevitable in the nature of being a superintendent.
I think that is so wise. We will end there. Our guest today was Dr. Larry Cuban, teacher, leader, professor, author. And I think you are so right, is that it is a job of conflict. It is a job of complexity. And when I say complexity, there isn't always a right answer. And I really am grateful for your wisdom today, for your time today, and for reminding us that good enough is a good thing. That's okay. Truly. Thank you so much for your time, Larry. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're back.
We're back. All right. Can I start with my I'm going to start with the beginning. The two things that I noticed, and this is obviously,
You're like so giddy.
Because it's kind of fun. It's really fun. I love that you kicked off with Scott Nearing, your favorite book, speaking of looking to the past.
I
right?
know. It's so
You
true.
quote Scott Nearing
because it just was so influential as a,
I'm with you. I'm not
so
against
interesting.
it. I'm not against it. I just love that you start with Scott Nearing and he just goes, yeah, Scott Nearing. He's just a disciple of Dewey.
I know.
But I actually do want to talk about the idea behind it, where he said the phrase remarkably stable, I think, is a fair phrase. Schools are set up primarily for many reasons to develop critical thinkers, good citizens, and socialize children. But the primary function of tax-supported public schools is to socialize children into the community's values. Here's my question, because I resonate with the idea of public schools as socializing institutions. How do we do this now as a society based as a country, where the society and our country being Americans is a thing versus the divided communities that are also a thing at this very moment? Like, how does public school socialize children in a way that works for the country, society, the American?
No, you're asking an impossible question. And I get it. I thought something very similar when I was re-listening in advance of our conversation and thinking to myself, divided communities where there are accusations like levied on schools immediately when you're trying to engage in critical thinking, and then it's considered, no, that's not critical thinking. What you're trying to do is brainwash, and you're going, no, we have a role to play in terms of. So I do think those who are effective at doing this work really get back to values. So I was talking with somebody recently. I'm trying to remember who I was talking to, because he mentioned to me the difference between subjective and objective truth. Objective truth, obviously, is something that is like everybody universally understands to be true. Subjective truth can mean that you both want to get to a certain destination and you believe to get there is two radically different ways.
Right.
So the pandemic was a great example of being able to discuss objective and subjective truth. And one would be, we have a community value that we want to keep kids safe. And one side said, keeping kids most safe is the social emotional piece of getting them back in class where they are together and socializing with each other, because we're seeing devastating things happen at home.
Right.
And another subjective truth is keeping kids safe is also keeping the whole family safe, because we are still at a point where we didn't have vaccines and all those kinds of things. And it could mean the absolute destruction of communities and families with the rising death tolls and people on ventilators and the rising having to bring in portable morgues, all those kinds of things. So both things were kind of true, subjective truth. And so how do you get there, especially right now in a country that is so fiercely divided, what it means to be? Yeah. So it is true that the schools are probably the best place to try to engage in not giving up on this current generation, but certainly thinking about its future generation. And then how do you leverage what we've learned in the past to sort of influence where we're going? So yeah, what a wildly impossible question to answer.
It's so difficult right now to answer that concept of that. Yeah, I do actually believe they do socialize children into our society. That's one of the things it does. But our society is so divided, and we have wildly different views on how we should be moved. To your point, wildly different values even. I actually don't know or necessarily agree that there is a common objective truth, to use your definition, anymore. There's a debate.
You say that it used to be the American dream, and however that was defined was radically different. I'm curious. I mean, Robert Putnam wrote about 1950s Port Clinton, Ohio, and I thought that got me the closest to understanding what a community value was in terms of all children succeeding and then communities coming together to make that possible.
Right.
And so I'm constantly striving to try to figure out how to get back to that, not 1950s America. Already major issues when it comes to race, class, gender, However, how do we, if we're looking at the socioeconomics of trying to find common ground, like that's an objective truth. We do want that for everybody to be able to not struggle, be able to provide their kids opportunities. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. My answer is I don't know. I think even my objective truth of a common value that I think people have, even me saying it makes me go, gosh, is this true? is show love for each other, show love for other human beings. And
Yeah, I actually think I was going to say, I'm glad you said love for others. I thought this is probably why the idea of belonging has taken root, is that this has become sort of a universal truth for everyone, that they want children to have a sense of belonging. There's nothing more human than a sense of belonging.
that raises something that just happened where one of the groups that we work with, that APC leadership works with, is in Oceanside, California. And these leaders, they're teacher leaders, counselors, APs, et cetera, there's a school in which they are trying to create a Muslim club for Muslim students during, club time. And people came to the board meeting saying some pretty horrible things about Muslims. And so this group is sort of activated and trying to go to the next board meeting to clarify, basically to push back and say, hey, what you said is not okay.
As a superintendent, I would tell you the first thing to look at is, what does your board policy say about clubs? I imagine they have a very strong and very clear policy about clubs, for the very
100%.
reason why, what they're called American Club now, what was Turning Point is now Club America or something like that. And why it's totally appropriate to have a Turning Point Club and a Gay Straight Alliance Club and a Young Democrats and Young Republicans. They all have to, and if they're not a school-sponsored club, all of these are not school-sponsored. They are clubs that are generated and created by students and have to have at least a sponsor or a supervisor that doesn't have to believe in the club other than to provide a safe place for students to meet.
And I believe the policy is that anybody can attend any club. So there's no closed door to
I'm telling you, this becomes an adult issue more than a kid issue. Because I watched the Council of Christian Athletes or the Fellowship of Christian Athletes Club co-presenting and co-organizing events with the Gay Straight Alliance. It's not, the kids have no issues with each other. They embrace their identities and their difference.
And they're looking for, your point, a space of belonging and connection in a public space, in a public school.
And I think that gets to your point of what the schools are supposed to be about.
I hope so. I really do.
A beacon, a convening, a place to convene and learn. The communities are, I thought you were going to ask me, what happens when the community's values are radically opposed to what is right and just in the world? Because you see that from place to place.
This is what I'm saying about objective to subjective truth. What does it mean to be right and just in the world? We're not in agreement, it doesn't look like, about what that means. And I'm sort of blown away by it.
And so what I think you're bringing up is how complex this really is. And, Dr. Cuban, he actually emphasizes that conflict shouldn't be seen as a failure, as we're sort of trying to figure out, like, oh my God, how do we create a community and a country where we can get back to this objective truth of trying to build something together? And he says, for the superintendency at least, it's inherent part of the job. Like, his quote is, the game of being a superintendent is a game of negotiating conflict all the time, every day. I cannot think of a day that was conflict-free. And I have to tell you, knowing who he is and where he works now and the influence he's had over 50 years or more, that was really liberating for me, who sometimes felt, 11 years in central office, 7 years as superintendent. He was 7 years in Arlington, and he described being burnt out. And I felt, seen, because I definitely felt burnt out. And also I felt that I had achieved so much. So I don't know. He talked about this balancing act that superintendents have to play. And I think that's kind of what you're describing, or at least rising or raising as an issue for all of us as we think about, the beloved community we all want to create.
I mean, this goes to, so the conflict that he brings up that he navigated in his after action review, I want to just name something that I think they get conflated, but they aren't the exact same conflict. And he says, in the district where I was working as superintendent for 7 years, the big deal was that the student enrollment was shrinking, and we were getting not only smaller, but more culturally diverse. We had a large influx of Latino boys and girls. There was a small segment of Black students. And so becoming ethnically and culturally diverse at the same time that you're becoming smaller led to the issue of closing schools. And then he says, and if you've ever had an experience with closing schools, it's conflict written in capital letters.
Yes.
All right. I fully agree. Closing schools, capital letters. The influx of students of color and families of color, different from what was the historical demographic of Arlington, is not directly tied to the closing of schools. These are not necessarily connected. They are conflated here without exploration as to why they're conflated. And I'm interested in knowing what happened, what was the conflict as it relates to race that came up in the closure of those schools. I don't know. I don't know what.
Right. Not appropriate for us to speculate.
No.
We can speak to history in other places. And so,
Correct.
my most recent experiences were in Kansas City and St. Louis. And so white flight was a part of that. Although Arlington has a high level of individuals with advanced degrees and all those kinds of things. And so I don't know if it's more like a Shaker Heights in that sense of diversifying and yet having high socioeconomic status and degrees and those types of things. So it's inappropriate for us to speculate, although certainly one to think about.
I was going to make a personal connection, if that's
Please.
okay, as I wear my Stanford sweatshirt. I'm from Palo Alto, born and raised.
Yep.
And I came up, I'm a kid, I'm a child of the 70s. And during my time as an elementary school student, I went to 4 different elementary schools, all because of school closures. Every single one, every single time. The school that I was in, which happened to be the most racially diverse, if you will, or larger.
Was it diverse? I was going to say.
Well, I would say
Was it-
larger percentage of families of color. Yes, it was actually
Okay.
quite diverse.
Okay.
But quite diverse as it relates to people of color. The number of white folks was smaller.
Yeah. Okay. That was my question, is whether or not those who had influence and affluence were attending the school.
No. The answer to that question is
Right.
no. And 4 schools before 6th grade. This was also to your point about shifting the demographic, the way that schools are. We had 6th grade in elementary schools at that point. And every single time we were pushed to go join a new community as kids. And it always was like, oh gosh, that's a big deal. And half the time, like those school closures were like moving from very densely populated areas of Palo Alto, where we had apartment buildings, to less densely populated areas that had larger houses. We, as kids, were then asked to ride to take transportation across major streets, across El Camino Real, which is the main thoroughfare. All of this sort of blows me away. What I want to ask is how, and you guys talked about this, about selling the benefit of the closures. What's the positive of the closures? And my primary argument for diversifying a school is that there is a benefit to it. What I don't think is ever brought up when you have multiple different kinds of people in a school is that you have multiple different kinds of people in a school. That is a benefit. If you're
benefit sometimes for the community to comprehend, and particularly, So
how come?
Well, again, this is the adult issue versus the kid. The kids see it as a great benefit. I'm going to learn and meet so many different people. The parents
Normalizing
are led
multilingualism.
By fear,
Normalizing-
they're led by fear, anxiety, and a fear of the other. As long as we've been a country, we've been afraid of the other. As every ethnic group arrived, the Irish arrived, the Italians arrived, the Jews arrived. Every one of them were ostracized by everybody else, right? Because of the fear of the other. And it's interesting because I remember reading, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, I was a superintendent. I had a pretty conservative board member who wanted to question my assertion that by diversifying the schools, it was going to be better. And together, really a credit to him, we found a really interesting study in Florida that talked about what happened when they started busing to balance the schools demographically. And then, of course, we've had a previous guest, Shelley Berman, who could speak about Lexington, Kentucky, Jefferson County, and the value. And when they dismantled it, how that changed for the worse, when they changed their busing program to make sure that the schools were diversified racially, ethnically, socioeconomically. And so I think presenting that kind of data doesn't necessarily capture one's heart. And so then it's hard to show. So then we've had a guest who was the superintendent in Hartford, Connecticut in my first season, I think. And she talked about the benefit that she was able to communicate in terms of programming. You want AP classes? We can provide them now. You want career and technical education? We can provide them now. You want extracurriculars that include robotics, photonics, band, all those kinds of things? We can provide them now because we were spending so much money on multiple schools that were under-enrolled. Now we've got one school. Now, the politics around which school is the one that stays open is a never-ending fight that's about political will, because I can express how I observed it as well. Those families that wanted a specific school because they interpreted it to be better because richer folks were there. It's insulting, and it's the reality of a community.
It's not the answer that you gave me. I understand the programming positive, and I believe in it, and I think it's great. What breaks my heart is the difficulty in understanding the human aspect of the benefit that's there.
Yeah.
That we have no way of actually indicating to someone else's heart that because there are 20 languages spoken at this school, it's better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you and I have talked, I think, even offline, just in terms of when we catch up on things, how most communities don't reflect a fully inclusive community. We used to refer to it in New York as a bento box, right? Communities and neighborhoods are radically separated from each other. They may ride the subway together, but then they go back to their space, their place. And so there are very few places, and you have the benefit of living in one of those places where people do live side by side. And so it is probably, I hope I'm not insulting you when I say this, like why you're so confused. Like, why can't we see that this is valued? And that's because you live in a pretty special place where it is valued.
I have a theory. I want to test this theory. I wish I could test this theory that if your desire is to actually say no to the board member that they're thinking about, says, no, I actually would prefer it not be racially diverse, but by definition, culturally diverse. Okay, I don't want that. Then the trade you have is that you may never eat any other food other than the one that you are choosing. That's it. That's the only one you get. So you get hot dogs. That's what you get. From now on, you just get hot dogs or whatever you would say that it is from there. I think this could work. I think if that's the trade, people will have a hard time, and I'll just speak from my own identity, people are going to have a hard time giving up Mexican food. It's because it's good.
Too funny.
And so they start thinking, well, I don't know. Yeah, exactly.
See, for me, they'd be like, I'll give up borscht. I'm good.
No, they won't. They will not give up latkes.
I know. I could say bagels. I thought that, but I thought
I would like to give up bagels. Are you crazy?
Yeah.
No way.
Yeah.
No way. Gefilte fish? Maybe. I might be able to let that go. All right. Anyway, that's what I really enjoy. It's funny. The professor is still teaching me. I really enjoyed the conversation. It made me, if I could go back to way back when, to the Post-it that's on your desk that says, why didn't you? I have so many questions for Dr. Cuban that like, well, I want to ask this and I want to ask that. And it's like, all of this is maybe telling me it's time for me to go back to school. And maybe we could, in our perfect society, as we get older, wouldn't it be amazing if university was then free for anybody of 50 and older?
Oh, that's great. I love it. Well, I mean, I feel like I've done all this learning over the last 5 years. I can't wait to get back into being the principal.
Oh, that's so funny. I've been on the ground for so long. I'm like, I'd like to just think for a while.
Yeah. And I'm like, I've been thinking for a while. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to do it. Last thing I do want to say, I really appreciated, I've heard this a couple of times from leaders, and this was communicated, I thought one of the best ways was just embracing the good enough.
Yeah, I wrote it.
If you want to be the person who's in classrooms and really being a presence for teachers and kids, give up. What did he say? I've given up. I had given up on seeking perfection decades ago. So what I've settled for is good enough.
Yeah.
And a good enough leader means that it fits the situation. That leader is a good fit with the environment. And I just thought I took that to also mean there are certain things you have to do, compliance stuff. And if you're trying to get an A+ on it, no one's giving you an A+ on it from the state level, from your district level, just get it done and then get to what matters. And so for me, you said you're still learning. I thought that was also, I didn't even know that it was his primary sort of message he wanted to send, but it was a takeaway that I didn't want to miss.
Yeah. I know. I think you can't miss it. I wrote it down. That's exactly, I just want to be good enough. I want to be good enough. And I want it, the good enough determined both by myself and as well as the people that I get to work with and partner with and touch. I want them to go, God, he was really great. Help me.
Yep.
That's it.
I love it.
No perfection, no nothing, none of that. I'm not going to reach that. Yeah, it was great. That was a lot of fun.
Good. Me too. I thought so too. All right, Jamie, we got another great person next week. So I will see you next week. You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. See you, Jamie.
See you later, Peter.